Good morning, everyone. My name is Peter Pham, and I'm the director of the Africa Center here at the Atlantic Council. On behalf of the Atlantic Council's chairman, Governor John Huntsman, and its president, Fred Kemp, it's my pleasure to welcome all of you, those present here at the Council in Washington and those joining us around the globe, especially those in Africa, through the webcast of this event. Welcome you to this policy address by the US Special Envoy for Sudan and South Sudan. Before formally introducing Ambassador Booth, permit me to say a word about the Atlantic Council's Africa Center. The Africa Center was established in 2009 with a mission to help transform US and European policy approaches to Africa by emphasizing the building of strong geopolitical partnerships with African states and strengthening economic growth and prosperity on the continent. The center seeks to engage and inform both policymakers and the general public of the strategic importance of Africa, both globally and for American and European interests in particular, through programs and publications, as well as a robust media presence. Within the context of the Atlantic Council's work to promote constructive U.S. leadership and engagement in international affairs, based on the central role of the Atlantic community in meeting international challenges, the Center supports and collaborates with the public and private sectors in forging practical solutions to the challenges and opportunities in Africa. It's in the spirit of this mandate that I'm pleased that we're able to host this particular discussion. Just 2 months ago, during the historic U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit, the largest event any U.S. president has held with African heads of state and government, with the privilege of organizing 11 high-level side events with presidents, cabinet ministers, business leaders, and representatives of civil society as we celebrate the strengthening of ties between the United States and one of the world's most dynamic and fastest-growing regions. As I've argued repeatedly, the story of Africa is increasingly one of buoyant prospects. However, at the same time, there remain very real security, humanitarian, and developmental challenges that prevent countries and regions from fully sharing in the burgeoning opportunities, challenges which must be confronted and which the United States has a stake in helping tackle. Among these are certainly the tragic conflict in South Sudan, as well as the future of Sudan. And it's within this context that 2 years ago, the Africa Center had the privilege of hosting Ambassador Booth's distinguished predecessor, Special Envoy, Ambassador Princeton Lyman, as he laid out a roadmap for U.S.-Sudan relations. 4 years ago this month, when Ambassador Booth was serving as the U.S. Ambassador in Addis Ababa, a group of colleagues and I, led by former Mozambican Prime Minister Luisa Diogo and former African Union Commission Deputy Chairperson Patrick Mazamhaka, came through Addis, having been asked by members of the AU Commission to examine some of the issues that need to be addressed in the prospect of the referendum that eventually led to the secession of South Sudan. In our report, we noted, quote, "It's often forgotten that two, not one, new states will emerge if the referendum results in succession. Finding the means to effect a win-win rather than a zero-sum outcome will not be easy. It will demand both sound leadership in the South and a high level of synergy among international partners. It will also require a commitment to reinforce and build linkages and interdependence between the two economies which already exist. A northern Sudan without the South will face fundamental causes of conflict and challenges for marginalized regions, the quest for democratic transformation and respect for human rights and other values. Constructive international engagement with Khartoum on these issues is essential for stability, for avoiding a broadening and deepening of existing fault lines, and a longer perspective for promoting reforms." And alas, we see ourselves 4 years later with much the same agenda. However, I'm hopeful that the patience, thought, and hard work that Ambassador Booth and his team have put into diplomatic efforts over the course of the last year will in time bear fruit. Donald Booth needs no introduction to many in this room. A career Foreign Service officer, he has served in various capacities in a number of bureaus at the State Department, including tours in the Bureau of African Affairs as Deputy Director of the Office of Southern African Affairs, as Director of the Office of West African Affairs, as well as Ambassador to the Republic of Liberia, where we first crossed paths, to the Republic of Zambia, and the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, before President Barack Obama appointed him US Special Envoy for Sudan and South Sudan in 2013. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Ambassador Donald Booth. Thank you.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I will start off with the African approach of all protocols observed. We have many excellencies in the room as well. Thank you for joining me today for this very important exchange, and a special thanks to the Atlantic Council and to Dr. Peter Pham. This is one of the nicer venues that I've delivered speeches in. I have a podium, the wind isn't blowing, and there are no insects buzzing around, so we should be off to a good start here. President Obama appointed me as his special envoy for Sudan and South Sudan just over a year ago. And it has been an eventful and in many ways a devastating year for the two Sudans. I welcome this opportunity to put our views of the situation in both countries on the table and to share our ideas and goals. Our goals are framed by our overarching policy orientation, which is very simply stated as two vibrant and prosperous states which enjoy the benefits of peace and a full partnership with the international community. I will begin by assessing the origins of the conflict in South Sudan. I'll offer some thoughts on the peace process, and I will identify what we believe are the 6 pillars that need to frame a solution for a political transition. I'll then turn to Sudan, in which I will review prospects for the national dialogue and consider a path by which Sudan can end its conflicts, initiate meaningful political process, and begin to realize a more peaceful and inclusive and prosperous future. Lastly, I'll offer a few thoughts on our bilateral relationship with Sudan, and before wrapping up, turn to some considerations on the continuing relationship between Sudan and South Sudan. Successive U.S. administrations, as well as many dedicated individuals and institutions, have for many years enjoyed a special relationship with the people of South Sudan, a relationship forged during the long civil war and the struggle for peace and self-determination. When the South Sudanese chose independence in 2011, all of us shared in the sense of promise. That is why, when less than 3 years later, the conflict that erupted in December 2013 and quickly spiraled out of control prompted not only shock, but a sense of sadness and disappointment at the opportunity that had been squandered. A country which enjoyed a chance to start afresh, one with a hopeful population, plentiful natural resources, and a great deal of regional and international support and goodwill, had surrendered its golden opportunity. It is critically important that the country's political leaders on all sides of this senseless conflict understand the disappointment that is shared by its friends inside and out of government in Washington and across the United States. But it is equally important that the people of South Sudan know that the commitment of their friends in America will endure. It will outlast the senseless war that now grips the country. We will support the people of South Sudan in ending this conflict, in reconciling their communities, and in realizing the promise now deferred. So let me speak now to the origins of the conflict. While the events of December 2013 are important for determining responsibility for crimes committed and to prevent future conflict, understanding the current crisis and shaping a credible transition and a sustainable peace requires a wider lens, a look to the broader context and dynamics that set the stage for this conflict. Many factors can be identified as root causes, including weak institutions, over-centralization, slow progress in security sector reform, corruption and financial mismanagement, and unresolved war-era tensions between the communities of South Sudan. But above all, this conflict is the product of a failure of leadership, a collective failure by those who had helped to deliver South Sudan its independence, not least among them the dominant political party that controlled the government, the SPLM. During the long civil war and the ensuing CPA period, opposition to the regime in Khartoum was the unifying principle. But when independence was realized in 2011, that common denominator disappeared and no new unifying vision took its place. Because of the injustices, underdevelopment, and conflict that the South had so long endured, the task that confronted the nation at its inception required all hands on deck. Building a peaceful and prosperous state was and is an enormous task, one that requires a unity of purpose among South Sudanese and the cooperation of its many international partners. But the void that followed liberation should have been filled by new ideas, a new agenda, new political programs, and organizing principles that might have emerged in the SPLM, but political ambition and a power struggle instead filled that void. And the people of South Sudan are now paying the price. As the aspirational principles of justice, equality, diversity, human rights, and decentralization that catalyzed the struggle lay abandoned. In describing the failure to transform a mandate of liberation to one of nation building, one prominent government party official told me in January, shame on us, we failed to learn the lessons of those African liberation movements that have gone before us. And the devastating consequences for the country's development, its health and education service delivery, its demilitarization, its collective healing, and its infrastructure development, in sum, for its people, now stand plainly before us. So what is the way forward? Where do we go from here? Let me say again, as it deserves repeating, that the United States is and will remain committed to a peaceful and prosperous future for South Sudan and its people. This is a long-term commitment that will outlast my tenure and that will outlast this administration. It is because of this partnership, shared by many other nations, that I am confident South Sudan can recover and can seize its missed opportunity. The post-conflict transition will take months, years, and in some instances, perhaps even a generation. But today, I would like to focus on the immediate task at hand, what we can do together in the near term to end the fighting, to initiate a political transition, and to set the stage for long-term success. I've spent the majority of the last 9 months in the region, working hand in hand with South Sudanese stakeholders, with IGAD partners, to help shape a peace process, wielding encouragement and diplomatic pressure as necessary. Activities we've supported have included forging regional and international unity behind the IGAD-led process, negotiating a cessation of hostilities agreement, creating a mechanism to monitor and verify compliance with that agreement, revising the UNMISS mandate to sharpen its focus to that of protection of civilians, negotiating humanitarian access agreements, providing support to the African Union Commission of Inquiry, and encouraging a multi-stakeholder process that can grapple with solutions and shape a political transition, the content of which I'll return to shortly. But before I do, I want to place special emphasis on the centerpiece of our policy approach to the peace process, inclusivity. Throughout the CPA period, and again after independence, authoritarian tendencies, elite decision-making, and undemocratic practices were among the principal grievances identified by South Sudanese who were outside the small circle of the elite. A concentration on the interests of elites was a prime ingredient in the making of this conflict. As such, yet another elite accommodation among the very actors responsible for the fracturing of South Sudanese society will not, cannot, alone deliver a sustainable peace. Let me repeat that. An elite accommodation among the individuals and factions at the heart of this crisis will not and cannot deliver a sustainable peace on its own. Since the IGAD mediation process began, our policy has been to help South Sudanese constituents and regional partners shape a process that is broadly inclusive, one that reflects the interests and aspirations of a wide range of stakeholders from all walks of South Sudanese society. Without them, any peace deal will lack the ownership necessary to mitigate future fragmentation of the country. Only when a majority of South Sudanese are invested in and served by a new national dispensation will that dispensation be too resilient to again break. The stakeholders participating in the peace process thus confront the most momentous of tasks. And to this end, I will remind those at the peace talks of a sentiment I have heard from many ordinary South Sudanese, that those participants must view their seat at the table not as a right, but as a responsibility. A responsibility to put national interests first, and a responsibility to reflect the views of a diverse polity. There has, throughout the crisis, been too great an emphasis on who can and should lead the country going forward, an unfortunate but familiar characteristic of South Sudan's highly personalized politics. The focus can not only be on who occupies the presidential palace, but on what needs to be done to put South Sudan on a path to peace and prosperity, what I call the transitional agenda. Defining the transitional agenda will in turn enable South Sudanese to decide who is best equipped to implement that agenda. And these decisions are intertwined. In this regard, I would like to outline 6 areas that we believe South Sudanese stakeholders should address as they develop the transitional agenda, and which we believe are necessary to restoring broad confidence of the people of South Sudan in their government. In each area, we have lent support to the mediation and the stakeholders through the sharing of ideas, the enlisting of resource experts, and drawing on lessons from other post-conflict experiences. First, the transitional security arrangements. Immediate measures are needed to put an end to the fighting, including disengagement and separation of forces, some of which are within hundreds of yards of each other still. Cessation of attacks on civilians, sustained humanitarian access, withdrawal of foreign forces, monitoring of agreed demilitarized areas, and ultimately redeployment of forces and signature of a permanent ceasefire. In the longer run, efforts to fundamentally reform the security sector must resume, and this task should be mandated to a broadly representative transitional mechanism with a role for international partners. Number 2, transitional governance arrangements. Given our long partnership with South Sudan, rumors abound as to whom we support, whom we don't, and whom we want to lead the forthcoming transition. But let me tell you, the truth is this: we have no personality prescriptions. Rather, the United States is focused on strengthening the institutions and supporting the development of a transitional agenda. As I said, it is our view that defining the transitional agenda is as essential a task for the negotiators as who is chosen to implement it and in what leadership configuration it is done. We believe a transitional government should accommodate voices, directly and indirectly, from all of South Sudan's communities and political constituencies. For a transition to be effective, the responsibilities, powers, and decision-making modalities must be clearly defined, not only for the principals, but also for the transitional cabinet and supporting transitional mechanisms. I would like to state clearly for the record and for all South Sudanese that the United States is, above all, eager to stand with those who choose peace, those who put their people ahead of political ambition, and those who recognize that the challenge ahead is bigger than any one individual, any one party, or any one ethnic community. Number 3, public financial management. Responsible management of South Sudan's natural resource revenue and spending needs to be a crucial element of a viable transition. South Sudan's leaders must know that when it comes to restoring donor partnerships, there can be no business as usual. Those who welcome donor funds to address the country's vast development agenda, while diverting the country's national resources into private pockets, must be disabused of the notion that the international community alone will bear the recovery and development burden. South Sudan must have a financial stake in the reconstruction, and the transitional mechanism should be structured so as to achieve a transparent and accountable management of state finances. Many South Sudanese have drawn attention to these issues in the wake of the crisis, and rightly seek a greater voice in how the country's resources are allocated. Number 4, justice, reconciliation, and healing. There is likewise among South Sudanese an appetite for mechanisms that will address new as well as long-deferred questions of accountability and reconciliation. We fully support IGAD, the African Union, and South Sudanese stakeholders in their desire to ensure that accountability and reconciliation are prominent elements of a transitional agenda. To this end, we have lent our support to the African Union's Commission of Inquiry, and we applaud the African Union for moving swiftly to establish this entity and appreciate the widespread consultations undertaken by President Obasanjo and his team. We look forward to their detailed findings and recommendations on appropriate transitional justice mechanisms. This will be an important moment, not only for South Sudan, but for African leadership on these issues. Number 5, a revised and reinvigorated permanent constitution process. After independence, the fledgling constitutional process to create a permanent constitution for South Sudan was slow, was largely neglected, it was underfunded. Rather than harnessing this process to engage citizens in a dialogue about post-independence goals and aspirations, political leaders in Juba instead focused narrowly on an elite power struggle. The current peace negotiations are not the forum through which to forge a new constitution. Rather, the stakeholders should revisit the terms of the constitutional process itself, revising the terms where necessary, and vesting it with the political weight needed to make it the kind of transformative process it could and should have been. A reinvigorated constitutional process may be the surest way to give many neglected South Sudanese communities a platform to voice their ideas and to invest them in a post-transition dispensation. And 6, the last, the roadmap to new elections. New elections should be held at the end of a transition, but they cannot be constructive if conflict, instability, or ethnic polarization persists. Transitional security arrangements must have brought about a modicum of security. Justice and reconciliation mechanisms must have taken root and begun to address impunity and to restore public confidence. Meanwhile, a review of existing legislation, an updated voter registration roll, sufficient funding and technical preparation, and adequate political space and protections are all necessary benchmarks if elections are to deliver what they intend to, representative institutions that can deliver the services and the development now deferred. So let me now turn to the humanitarian crisis in South Sudan. While peace negotiations continue, we remain ever mindful of the devastating man-made humanitarian crisis unfolding before us. More than 1.8 million people have been displaced, and 4 million, that's close to 40% of the country's population, face acute food insecurity. The United States has thus far contributed roughly $720 million of emergency relief. Yes, $750 million, and will remain committed to alleviating this dire situation. However, insecurity, access restrictions, and harassment of humanitarian actors continue to hinder the delivery of the life-saving assistance so desperately needed. We urge all parties to allow unhindered humanitarian access by river, by road, now that the roads are drying out, and by air. And while modest improvements have been achieved over the past few months in delivery of humanitarian assistance, much remains to be improved. The warring parties bear full responsibility for this crisis and the suffering of their fellow South Sudanese, And I want to reiterate that those obstructing humanitarian access also run the risk of US sanctions. Let me talk a little bit about the IGAD peace process. Despite the tireless efforts of the mediation effort led by the regional partners, IGAD, and the diplomatic reinforcement of the United States and our Troika, EU, and other partners, both the government and the opposition have failed to engage the process in good faith or to fully honor their commitments. Both have likewise failed to seize political opportunities, to exercise visionary leadership, or to take positions that would have regained for them the confidence lost in the eyes of so many South Sudanese. Despite the advances codified in the January 23rd, May 9th, and subsequent agreements, both sides have attempted to walk back on those commitments, weaken the process, narrow its scope, and exclude others from the negotiating table, all the while continuing a senseless fight on the battlefield. We cannot stand idly by as the warring parties neglect the suffering of their own people. Thus, in addition to our diplomatic efforts, President Obama in April signed an executive order establishing a regime for targeted individual sanctions, travel bans, and asset freezes. These punitive measures would target any individual who threatens peace and security, obstructs the peace process, obstructs delivery of humanitarian assistance, or is deemed responsible for gross violations of human rights. We have listed 4 individuals to date and are currently considering the cases of others who may meet these criteria. These measures are intended to press the parties toward a negotiated political solution. To this end, the time has come for the broader international community to send the same clear message by authorizing targeted UN Security Council sanctions, a unified signal that this senseless war is unacceptable and that those responsible for its continuation will pay a price. Let me make clear that such measures will not target the state, but rather those individuals who continue to drive the country's downward spiral. We will instead stand with those individuals ready to exercise bold leadership and to articulate a way out of the crisis. If this current round of IGAD-led talks fails to yield a solution, and if the 45-day deadline passes, we must all be ready to move swiftly, increasing our pressures, reconsidering the scope and format of our engagement, and acting decisively to ensure South Sudan does not slip into a perpetual state of low-intensity conflict, ethnic division, and weak government. Neither the region nor the international community can allow this to happen. So let me now turn to Sudan. As much as the conflict in South Sudan has demanded our collective attention this year, we have maintained an equally sharp focus on Sudan. Sudan presents a uniquely challenging set of circumstances, but also an important set of interests. Our relationship with Sudan has been strained for many years, above all because of the injustices suffered by its people. I would like to briefly review here where we have been, where we are now, as understanding both the pitfalls of the past and missed opportunities will be critical to understanding how to avoid them going forward, and how to help pave a road toward a sustainable peace, a normalization of US-Sudan relations, and restoration of a relationship based on mutual understanding and shared interests. I will then outline what we see as the key elements of a process by which Sudan might end its multiple conflicts, confront fundamental issues of governance, and realize a more inclusive future. To this end, I will discuss the role of the United States and the international community in supporting the Sudanese people in this task. And let me say here that our commitment to the people of Sudan and to their collective aspirations will remain equally steadfast. Some 3 decades ago, I served as the Sudan desk officer at the State Department. It was a time when relations between our 2 countries were very different than they are today. At that time, cooperative relations enabled us to champion debt relief and support economic development. We shared common objectives with regard to the region and its security, as well as a military-to-military relationship. Sudan was in a period of relative peace, with the South enjoying a degree of autonomy. A major American oil company was then actively engaged in exploration in Sudan, some 15 years before oil would come online and become the country's principal source of revenue. A look back to this period demonstrates that relations between our two countries need not be defined by antagonism, mistrust, or economic and political sanctions. Instead, they can be defined by goodwill, cooperation, and shared mutual interests, a theme that I will return to shortly. Even at that time, a center-periphery imbalance existed in Sudan. This fundamental flaw in the structure of the Sudanese state would widen under ensuing governments, marginalizing more than a few of Sudan's diverse communities. The concentration of power and resources in the center meant gross neglect of the needs and aspirations of those who lived outside the center. As the political landscape continued to evolve, expressions of religion, culture, and identity that did not match those of the riverine elite and of the ascendant Islamists were suppressed. War resumed, and in time, the political arena became increasingly cynical. Ideas and discourse gave way to corruption and nepotism, and the state was drained of much talent and resources. The consequences of this slow deterioration are particularly evident today when one examines the dire state of the Sudanese economy. Strained by a huge current account deficit and the loss of billions in oil revenues, the government has had to turn to extraordinary measures to shore up its emptying coffers. Inflation has surpassed 45%. High unemployment and a weakening currency mean families struggle to make ends meet. Sudan owes creditors some $45 billion in debt and has suspended payments even on many of its most recent loans. Meanwhile, military spending and the prosecution of two wars are bankrupting an already ailing economy. But beyond the numbers is a loss of confidence. Sudanese entrepreneurs are investing elsewhere, and what is left of the country's professional class is again beginning to leave Sudan, disillusioned by corruption and economic woes. The question on the minds of many is this: will this dire state of affairs prompt the leadership to undertake real reform? In January this year, President Bashir delivered a much-heralded policy speech, one that caught the attention of Sudanese and international observers alike. While many dismissed it as empty rhetoric, the commitment to undertake a national dialogue and the identification of core challenges to be addressed therein, peace, political freedoms, poverty, and especially the reference to national identity, were both welcome and worthy of note. While such initiatives have in the past proven disappointing, many wondered whether the state of the economy, the costs of continuing wars, internal National Congress Party dynamics, and scheduled elections might this time provide a chance for meaningful discourse. Or would this be yet another empty exercise, a thinly veiled attempt to bridge the regime to unfair elections and a renewed air of legitimacy? In June, Secretary Kerry and his Troika counterparts from the UK and Norway together welcomed the stated intent of the ruling party to initiate an inclusive national dialogue, a dialogue that many Sudanese had long called for. He noted that, quote, a common understanding of the dialogue process and the desired goals, coupled with an environment conducive to openness and inclusivity, would invite the broadest participation and offer the best chance for success. But to date, realization of the promised national dialogue remains uncertain. In the intervening months, details of the purported dialogue were few, and actions taken by the government at times appeared to run contrary to its stated intent, actions which further constrain political space and harden doubts of the skeptics. The government also indicated it would press ahead with elections as scheduled in April of next year. This time frame simply cannot allow for a meaningful political process, and the increasing attention on electoral preparation was viewed by many as an attempt to scare some of the existing opposition parties into joining a dialogue before the train left the station. But many of Sudanese resisted that pressure, that temptation. Instead, they articulated their views as to what would constitute a conducive environment for their participation in a genuine dialogue. These declarations brought diverse opposition elements together and were followed by a series of principles, for example, the Paris Declaration, signed by opposition actors, and at least some nominal government representatives signed on as well under the facilitation of the African Union. This unity of opposition, even if tactical, prompted renewed interest and hope about the possibility of a credible dialogue. President Mbeki, chairman of the African Union High-Level Implementation Panel, returned to Khartoum to secure President Bashir's endorsement of these principles and of a process to make the dialogue a reality. These are encouraging signals, but of course, the proof will come in timely and measurable progress toward dialogue and agreed reforms. In this regard, I would like to draw attention today to the set of principles on peace and democratic governance in Sudan, which we issued together with Troika colleagues last month. These principles reflect the views of many Sudanese on the resolution of conflict and the character of a credible dialogue. I will summarize them here as follows. First, there is no military solution to Sudan's conflicts, and compartmentalized and regional approaches to peacemaking cannot address grievances and aspirations that are national in character. Second, dialogue should address fundamental issues of governance, inclusiveness, resource sharing, identity, social equality at the national level. And lastly, a conducive environment is essential for any such dialogue to succeed. The outcomes of a dialogue might ideally, and I'll give you another list, I'm good at lists here. 1, uphold the country's territorial integrity. 2, accommodate its unique diversity of peoples, cultures, and religions. 3, yield an inclusive governance arrangement that allows for participation in democratic institutions. And 4, agree a timeline and benchmarks for the holding of legitimate national elections. And let me say here that while the ruling party is principally responsible for initiating a credible dialogue, we have regularly stressed to the armed opposition that they too must engage constructively in building a process toward political, not military, solutions. We have encouraged the armed and unarmed opposition to champion the national dialogue, not simply to wait for the government or to criticize its inaction, but to seize this valuable opportunity to articulate a common agenda and build national consensus toward comprehensive solutions. While we welcome the prospect of a credible national dialogue, let me assure you that we remain deeply concerned about the ongoing in both the two areas and Darfur, where new fighting, large-scale civilian displacement resulting from attacks on civilians, and a humanitarian crisis remain the dominant narrative. Instability in Sudan's peripheries is costly, it is unsustainable, and it has caused undue strain on all Sudanese, center and periphery alike. And the recurring military offensives and counteroffensives are all the more senseless given the reality, proven season after season, that neither side can win this war. This fact has become a source of division within the Sudanese political class, where some regret the endless state of conflict and the perpetual reliance on security solutions. We believe it is also a source of resentment among some in the military, who regret the proliferation of paramilitary activity and harken back to the era when the Army was the proud institution characterized by respect for it and its professionalism. These conflicts in Darfur and the two areas, like those previously in the east and in the south, each have unique manifestations, but they are all symptoms of a common national problem. For too long, the focus of conflict resolution efforts in the peripheries and the supporting international architecture was focused regionally. Fortunately, the international community has increasingly come to recognize this problem. I think President Mbeki characterized the issue very well in 2009 when he said that there's not a Darfur problem in Sudan, there's a Sudan problem in Darfur. We must ensure that this recognition is reflected in our own policy approach and that of other engaged countries and institutions, and in the international architecture mandated to resolve the conflict. The advent in 2012 of the Sudan Revolutionary Front further illustrates the point, as different armed movements, as well as unarmed actors, aware of the government's attempts to isolate them and address their grievances through separate processes, coalesced in recognition of the national nature of their struggle and of any sustainable solution. In Darfur, the government and one rebel movement signed the 2006 Darfur Peace Agreement, but this failed to change Darfur's realities. 5 years later, the Doha Document for Peace in Darfur, the DDPD, was signed, but again, it lacked the endorsement of major Darfuri armed movements. The DDPD, despite its efforts to engage those most affected by conflict, its thoughtful provisions, and its continuing potential to deliver local recovery and development, has gone largely unimplemented. As with prior regional agreements, civilian security, meaningful governance reforms, accountability, and an equitable distribution of resources remain elusive. Instead, we have sadly witnessed a resurgence of violence in Darfur, as well as in the two areas, much of it again generated directly and indirectly by the state. In addition to clashes between armed opposition and the Sudanese armed forces, aerial bombardment and the introduction of so-called Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, not to be confused with the SRF, proved particularly devastating to civilian populations. RSF units have attacked civilians, burned villages, and displaced thousands as part of what appears to be a deliberate campaign. Meanwhile, intertribal fighting and shifting alliances, conflict between opposition factions, and opportunistic banditry, when coupled with dried-up patronage networks laid atop a competition for resources, have made for an increasingly complex security landscape in Darfur. And the continuing environment of impunity contributes to sustained cycles of violence. Meanwhile, the United Nations joint mission with the African Union, the peacekeeping mission in Darfur, UNAMID, which had a broad mandate to boost security, protect civilians, and implement successive peace agreements, while at the same time trying to mediate new peace, continues to face challenges. These include attacks on peacekeepers. I think the death toll is in the hundreds in UNAMID. Key personnel and asset shortages continue, and there remain access restrictions for UNAMID. The mission has also been met with performance criticism. To this end, the UN Security Council last month adjusted the mandate so as to maximize the mission's impact and focus on the core task of protection of civilians. We're working with the United Nations, the African Union, and troop contributing partners to reinforce our collective support for UNAMID. In the two areas where another 100,000 people have been newly displaced in the past 6 months, an escalation of conflict can be attributed largely to two government offensives, including RSF assaults and heavy aerial bombardment. These bombardments include what appears to be deliberate targeting of humanitarian infrastructure and supply lines, to include hospitals and clinics. I've been involved in intermittent talks over the last year between the government and the SPLM North, facilitated by the African Union panel. The talks struggled to advance, in part because there was no realistic mechanism to make parallel progress for the conflict in Darfur. Again, a recognition that neither an end to fighting nor political solutions could be reached in a compartmentalized fashion. What is needed is a path for all parties to confront Sudan's problems together in the context of a national framework. So what is the way forward? With this in mind, I'd like to outline what we see as a viable way forward toward a meaningful national dialogue that brings the armed groups on board and helps bring a permanent end to conflicts. I'm going to give you 3 steps that constitute the approach now being advanced by President Mbeki and the African Union High-Level Panel. And I want to reiterate, fully support these steps. First, is the resumption of security talks toward a cessation of hostilities agreements and humanitarian access agreements in both Darfur and the two areas. These two tracks must necessarily be advanced in parallel and coordinated manner and should be facilitated by the AU panel with broad support from the UN. Each track must address local issues, but broader coordination is necessary to reflect the realities of armed engagement on the ground. These agreements should also identify a common path to a permanent ceasefire, one that will hinge on inclusive political dialogue and a broadly endorsed political outcome. Second, a pre-dialogue meeting outside Sudan, bringing together representatives of the government, opposition parties, the armed opposition, and other important constituencies who together can agree the terms, timeline, and objectives of the national dialogue. And third, additional confidence-building measures would then signal good faith and create that environment conducive to open dialogue. These might include release of political prisoners, easing of restrictions on political activity and public expression, and mutual observance of what we hope will be negotiated cessation of hostilities agreements. These steps would provide the groundwork to begin a credible national dialogue inside Sudan, ideally facilitated by President Mbeki or another independent actor. Meanwhile, it is essential that the international community speaks with one voice in support of this strategy, including key voices from the African Union, the Arab League, Qatar, China, Europe, the Troika, and Sudan's immediate neighbors. Again, we welcome the stated intent of the national dialogue and will continue to follow it closely. I thank you for your patience, and this brings me to a final and critically important discussion of our bilateral relationship with Sudan. The relationship between Khartoum and Washington, as you all know, has for too long been characterized by mistrust and miscommunication. So deep is the mistrust, and so infrequent is the opportunity for constructive dialogue, that the underlying interests and objectives are often miscommunicated. Let me make absolutely clear that the United States' long-term interest in Sudan is, as it is in every country, a bilateral relationship where our countries work together on common interests. Our interest is a democratic and prosperous Sudan, one at peace with itself and with its neighbors. It is a Sudan with which the United States can trade, can partner, and can contribute to the unbounded potential which African states and America can achieve together as partners. Our concern for marginalized populations, our interests in the resolution of deadly internal conflicts, and our support for democratic governance derive from principles that reach far beyond Sudan. They orient us in our posture toward states around the globe, and they will remain enduring elements of any U.S. relationship with Sudan. But we stand ready to work with the Sudanese on these issues and on areas of mutual interest and potential cooperation. The majority of the Sudanese people have no interest in a collapsing economy, no interest in war or divisive politics, no interest in extremism or international isolation. They seek what we seek, a new chapter in Sudan, one in which this country of vibrant communities and rich history succeeds. Despite the disappointments of the past, I believe there remains an opportunity to realize a better relationship, and we must engage towards this end. We cannot accept a Sudan mired in conflict or a relationship lost to mistrust. The tumult of the region in recent years demonstrates the vital importance of stability and mutual engagement. We must together chart a course forward. To this end, I reiterate my readiness and that of my government to engage the Sudanese in a more frank and frequent exchange, to visit Khartoum, and to discuss the full range of issues that frame our bilateral relationship. My last point, I promise we're getting to the end, is the Sudan-South Sudan relationship, the continuing interconnectivity of these two countries. The relationship between Sudan and South Sudan remains critically important to us, to the region, and to the long-term strategic interests of both countries. the September 27 agreements of 2012, which the United States played a critical supporting role in brokering, identified solutions for critical post-referendum issues, helped prevent renewed conflict between Sudan and South Sudan, and importantly, recognized the inevitability and opportunity of their continued interconnectivity. And while many successes can be cited, many critical elements also remain unimplemented. And thus, while the focus has turned to domestic situations in both countries, and while domestic stability is a critical ingredient in solid relations between the two states, we must also remain vigilant about the state of bilateral relations. Areas that we are watching include issues of trade and mutual economic viability. The economic interests of the two countries are, for the foreseeable future, best served by continued economic cooperation and the notion, popularized at separation, of two mutually viable states. Oil production remains a lifeblood for both, and a renewed and equitable agreement on the joint export of oil, to be revisited in 2016, is a necessary bedrock of mutual economic viability in the medium term. While the largest concentrations of populations in both countries are located near the shared border, the full potential of cross-border trade and movement remains unrealized. Free trade and movement across historical corridors can build a value chain that binds and stabilizes the borderlands as well as the two countries. Furthermore, the September 27 agreements included an arrangement in which Sudan agreed to assume all pre-secession sovereign debt, provided that the two countries work together to secure debt relief from creditor countries. We have welcomed Sudan and South Sudan's flexibility in extending this so-called zero option, and we remain available for discussions with the Sudanese on the many steps necessary to realize debt relief. We will, meanwhile, continue to also press Juba to follow through on its commitment for joint outreach. Second, borders and security. Recent history demonstrates that instability in one state can register deep impact on the other. The two countries' shared border, one of the longest in Africa, remains a centerpiece of this security interdependence. Political tension in 2011, the presence of oil reserves near the border, disputes over demarcation of the border, the market for cross-border trade, and the proximity of populations meant that this frontier was then and remains both a critical security concern and a frontier of potential and essential cooperation. Fortunately, the dangerous postures assumed by armies on both sides in 2011 did not escalate. But the posturing underscored the need for a border security regime. The mechanisms envisioned in the September 27 agreements, principally the safe demilitarized border zone and its 10 crossing corridors, were intended to facilitate joint border management and reduce the trust deficit. But neither side has invested the political capital necessary to fully operationalize these mechanisms and thereby realize the opportunities of a normalized border. Unless and until these mechanisms are operationalized and proxy support ended as agreed, the border will remain both an irritant and a drag on shared potential. In this context, I want also to reiterate our strong concern about destabilizing activity being advanced on both sides of the border and call for an end to support to armed proxies as agreed. The vision of two countries living side by side in peace will not be fulfilled as long as either state continues to pursue such narrow and short-sighted cross-border destabilizing activities. They must end now. And the third issue is Abyei. Sadly, the final status of Abyei remains unresolved. Its people are marooned in a state of limbo and insecurity. And as long as it is unresolved and seasonal migrations continue without agreed terms, the potential to draw Sudan and South Sudan back into wider conflict persists. An inward turn in both countries, most notably in South Sudan, has virtually stopped all bilateral negotiations on outstanding post-referendum issues, including the final status of Abyei. while concurrent disputes over the establishment of a joint local administration has brought progress on local stability, administration, and development. There has been a lack of progress on establishing any joint local administration, and this has brought administration and development to a halt. We remain deeply concerned about this fragile situation and are working with UNISFA to help improve the humanitarian situation and manage tensions. The final resolution of this dispute, however, is the responsibility of both governments, and we continue to believe that the September 2012 Mbeki plan remains the most viable path to a fair and lasting solution of this dispute. In the interim, we must do all that we can to improve the lives and livelihoods of the residents of Abyei, as well as of those who regularly migrate through the area. So in closing, let me underscore that focused U.S. engagement with Sudan and South Sudan is as robust and remains as important as at any time in recent history. To that end, I welcome the continued engagement, advocacy, ideas, and support of the many dedicated individuals and institutions who have long been friends of the people of both Sudan and South Sudan. I thank you, and I look forward to your thoughts and your questions.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for that very comprehensive and certainly provocative exposition and really tour d'horizon. I'm going to exercise the moderator's prerogative and just tee up a few questions and then before opening up to the audience. You mentioned the keeping open the option of and seeking broader UN Security Council sanctions for those who are threatening the continuing conflict in South Sudan. What about the issue of an arms embargo? We have U.S. Arms embargo. Our European friends have an arms embargo imposed, but there's no UN arms embargo, and thus we've seen credible reports of arms shipments coming into both sides in the conflict in recent weeks and months.
Well, thank you very much for that question. It really does fit in with what the international community can do to put greater pressure on those parties who continue to fight to turn their attention toward achieving and implementing a peace agreement. This has been part of our strategy all along, working with IGAD, has been to try to continually increase the pressures on the party, the incentives for them to negotiate seriously. This has included, for example, our own sanctions regime, to which the European Union followed Sudan. It includes the development and deployment of the monitoring and verification mechanism. It includes the bringing of regional troops into UNMISS so that there would be a more credible force to actually implement the mandate for protection of civilians. So we are now looking at what additionally can be done, and to take what's been done by the U.S. and the European Union and to take that a step further at the UN is currently on the docket. What the exact shape of that UN pressure might be, what can be achieved in the Security Council is something that we're in the process of working through right now.
Thank you. And then I think everyone would agree that at least objective observers on your analysis that really what is going on is not a fight between the peoples of South Sudan, but an elite power struggle that regretfully has spilled beyond the political into an armed conflict. And but there seems to be a bit of a tension between obviously the need to engage the armed parties to end the conflict, to disengage them, and then to eventually disarm them. And that requires a dialogue with armed factions. And the other part, which is the political dialogue, the inclusivity you mentioned. How do we not reward people for creating facts on the ground by having the armed force in the first place, and yet still engage them to cease the fighting, or at least prevent its renewal?
Well, this has been at the crux of a lot of the back and forth that has gone on at the negotiations over the past 8 months, 9 months. which is who should be at the table. Is it just the armed factions that need to make peace, but is that peace sustainable? And this is where the idea of bringing in other voices, clearly the armed factions will have a veto on any peace agreement. The armed actors need to be ones that agree to put down their arms. But that peace agreement can be broader. It can include issues that are brought to the table by others so that this peace agreement can become something that is more sustainable, that will give South Sudan really the opportunity to move forward, to take advantage of this transitional period of the development of a new constitution to really start afresh, to have a rebirth, a South Sudan 2.0, if you will.
And one final question before turning it to the audience, and that's, I think those our friends in Sudan would welcome and will welcome your comment that the U.S. will continue to press South Sudan on its responsibilities and for the zero option to continue to seek the debt relief for that Sudan agreed to the debt that Sudan agreed to assume. On the other hand, given the long agenda that has yet to be articulated internally within South Sudan and the process, they're going to be consumed inward, and so one can press them, but obviously their priorities are elsewhere in a way that it seems to leave Sudan sort of shackled to a party that is, for whatever reason and dynamic, now consumed with its own internal agenda. So how do we help them move it forward while at the same time recognizing that attention is distracted?
Well, as I mentioned, I mean, it's not just debt, it's a whole range of the post-referendum issues, post-independence issues that need to be addressed, the September agreements from 2012. But I think clearly the South Sudanese can lend their voice as Sudan approaches its creditors, not just the United States, but a whole range of creditors, to show a solidarity on that issue. And so I think this is something that doesn't require a peace in South Sudan, even a transitional government, to be able to tackle this issue, and frankly some of the other issues that were laid out and agreed in the September 2012 agreements.
Thank you very much. Now we open to questions. If you please wait for the microphone to come to you, and then also identify yourself over here.
Thank you, Ambassador Booth, for that excellent speech. I just wanted to follow up on Peter's point and just sort of make sure I understand, does the U.S. have a position on the proposal for an arms embargo? And could you clarify what the United States' current bilateral position is on security cooperation with the South Sudanese government, given the current conflict?
After the events of December, the United States basically froze security assistance, our security assistance program with South Sudan. We have utilized some of the funding that was appropriated for that, re-notified it, and have used that to support the monitoring and verification mechanism. We allowed 2 IMET students that were in classes to finish, but we are not going forward with any new security assistance as long as the conflict continues. In terms of the arms embargo, as I said, it's one piece of what could become international architecture for increasing the pressures on the parties in South Sudan to move away from fighting and toward peace. So it's an issue that's under consideration. It has to be looked at in the context of what can be achieved in an international context in the UN Security Council. And we will try to do what we can to ensure that we get as strong an international regime as possible going forward.
Right, the gentleman right there. And please identify yourself, please.
Say what?
Please identify yourself.
Yes, my name is Nile Shotut. My question, Ambassador, is this is one of American hero who fought the Iraq War. He was killed by the South Sudan government. What are you doing about him? Or is not only him alone, there was other 7 people. these are the people that I didn't hear anything that you talk about today. Can you say why?
Well, I think I talked about the dire humanitarian situation. I think we all know that thousands of people were killed, and the U.S., the first priority we had when this conflict broke out was the protection of American citizens. We evacuated those who wanted to leave. We ensured no one was left behind who wanted to leave. We remain in touch with those American citizens we know are still in country. We find it very regrettable that anyone lost their life in this conflict. It's a conflict that is, as I say, was man-made. It is senseless, and we're doing all we can to bring it an end to it so that additional lives are not lost.
I wondered with regards to Sudan, you expressed a willingness for a more robust kind of engagement or continued robust engagement with Khartoum, the possibility of the new dialogue. What is the level of, what's the state of discussion around potentially an ambassador, for example, who can kind of be on the ground to see and work that process through?
Yeah, the accrediting of ambassadors is one of many issues that are on the bilateral agenda, and something that needs to be looked at in the context of movements on both sides to try to begin to take steps that are possible that would build confidence going forward. But to even begin that process, we really need to have a dialogue. We need to be able to engage with senior Sudanese officials in Khartoum. We need to be able to see that moving on any particular front, such as the issue of an ambassadorial accreditation, that it will indeed be part of achieving the types of outcomes that we've long been seeking in Sudan.
Hi, Teresa Welsh with US News. You spoke a little bit about sanctions that have been placed on individuals and said there's the possibility for more to be placed. Could you speak a little bit more about what sort of conditions would lead to the United States taking that action against further individuals?
Well, individuals sanctioned to date have been military commanders who have been associated with particular military actions, atrocities that have occurred. But that's not the only category that is allowed, that we would target people for under the sanctions. We can also look at people who are responsible for hindering humanitarian assistance delivery and for hindering the peace process. So we're looking at a number of individuals under all of the categories of the executive order. We're not going to speculate on who or what categories might be in the next round. But we remain committed to utilizing that lever to the extent that we believe that it will help facilitate serious negotiations. Again, our aim is to facilitate negotiation, not to cut off negotiation.
Ambassador, let me follow that up since we're on the question of sanctions. Sudan, of course, is under a series of sanctions, some of it really legislatively imposed by Congress and signed by the President, having to do with the Darfur, from the Darfur period, the crisis, but some also arising from the state sponsor of terror designation, which has lingered, and I know it's been a sore point and no doubt will be part of discussions with Sudan. At the same time, we have our annual terrorism report, which states Sudan actually has been in recent years helpful on the counterterrorism front. So any comments on those specific sanctions related to the issue of state sponsor of terrorism?
Yeah, let me say there are technical issues relating to that particular sanction. One is that there would have to be a track record over a period of time where we would determine that there had not been engagement in any state sponsor of terrorism. There would have to be a commitment from the government of Sudan, written commitment not to undertake any further, any state sponsor of terrorism. And then there's the political conditions. And the political conditions really are based on what our sanctions are based on. It is the conflicts that go on in the periphery, how the people in the periphery of Sudan are being treated, how they're being targeted because of their differences with the center. And so one of the things that I stress is, a good place to start would be to stop bombing your own people. And then we can see where that can lead.
Thank you. I'm Alan Reed. I have a question about credible civil society. Do you see any opportunities, as you talked about broadening inclusivity, for a role for credible civil society in either side of the conflict in the South?
I think one of the important achievements of the negotiations was to bring, to get accepted by the warring parties the idea that there should be other stakeholders at the table. This has been accepted and rejected at various times in the negotiations. Civil society has probably proven the most difficult to actually determine who represents civil society, as both the government and the opposition had ideas as to who constitutes legitimate civil society. Other organizations in the country had views as to who constituted it. The process that was initiated, there were several conferences that were held both inside and outside of South Sudan, bringing civil society actors together to give them the opportunity to self-select who would represent their voices. The U.S. funded one of the efforts by IGAD to bring about 60 civil society organizations, wide range from all parts of the country, including a number of religious leaders, together in Addis back in March. Some of those are now members of the civil society delegation. But it's a concept that's actually proven more difficult to implement. It makes sense, I think, to most of us in this room that people who are not in government should have at least the ability to voice their views. But it's also not a national convention. And so numbers have to be limited, and then you get into the issue of who actually is civil society. We feel that the process that's been undertaken has really tried to get civil society to self-select who's going to be there. It has not been easy.
Gentleman right there.
Thank you, Ambassador Bush. My name is Gadwich. I'm a fellow at NDI. My question is regarding the IGAD peace mediating process. IGAD as a mediating process is also has some member of the states that are involved in the conflict, fighting along the government. For example, if you see Uganda, how can the conflict of interest be targeted while doing this peace process, while the member states of IGAD are partakers of the conflict? Thank you.
Let me just address the issue of IGAD mediation. The countries of the region, the members of IGAD, are the closest to the conflict. They are the ones that have the most to lose from this conflict, other than the people of South Sudan. And they are the ones that can bring the greatest pressure to bear on the respective parties to bring about an end to this conflict. So they were chosen, as the African Union normally does. They look to the regional organization, the sub-regional organization, to deal with the issue in that sub-region. The issue of one of the members who has armed forces in South Sudan was addressed by not having them be part of the mediation team. And let's not forget that South Sudan is still a member of IGAD, and so the government has been represented at IGAD summits. But I think interestingly, and we don't see this in many crises or conflicts of this nature, the opposition was also brought in to those IGAD summits. So the voices of the two fighting sides, I think, have been accommodated and brought in by IGAD. And IGAD, as I say, has the ability, has the greatest leverage to bring about an end to this conflict, and we continue to fully support IGAD's leadership role, just as we continue to look to see how we can reinforce and strengthen the leverage that they have to try to achieve a breakthrough in these negotiations.
Thank you, Ambassador Booth. Justine Fleischner from the Enough Project. On the issue of sanctions, we've heard the regional mediation time and again promise punitive measures. They haven't taken action. I'm curious what your sense is at this point of the regional willingness to move forward with sanctions if the Security Council could move forward with a global sanctions regime, if the region doesn't actually ask for it first, if there's any complication with an arms embargo. Obviously, Uganda has very strong relationship with South Sudan on the military front. And then on the inclusivity piece, I think we all recognize the limitations of civil society in South Sudan and those that are actually at the peace talks. Is there a willingness to invest in alternatives like public opinion polling, grassroots initiatives in South Sudan to build up documentation efforts of the violence and just to broaden out the efforts that we can make right now to promote inclusivity outside of specifically the peace talks in Ethiopia? Thank you.
Well, let me address the second part of that. The documentation of what has gone on is something that has been undertaken by many different groups, the primary ones being the African Union Commission of Inquiry, and also by UNMISS, which has an extensive human rights section, which has delivered, I think it was in April, a very extensive human rights report documenting what they saw as having happened during the process of the conflict. I think another 6-month report is due out from UNMISS shortly. The idea of an observatory where people on the ground can report is something that is in the process, I think, of being developed. As you know, there are real communications and transportation problems in South Sudan, and so it may not work as effectively as it has in other places, but could be another outlet and one that we believe people should have the opportunity to take on. In terms of the region's support for punitive measures, they've talked about that. It was written into IGAD summit communiques in the past. What we're hearing from IGAD member states is that tool is still in their toolbox, and they are prepared to use that tool when they see the time is right. Obviously, we want to coordinate with them, and the more forward-leaning they are in signaling their desire to use that tool, the easier it would be to move forward in New York on this. But there are many indications we have that the patience with this process is wearing rather thin.
I think we have time for one more gentleman there.
Hi, Dan Sullivan with United to End Genocide. Ambassador Booth, you mentioned the role of continued impunity in continued instability in Darfur and other areas. We saw that President Bashir just recently traveled to Saudi Arabia. He continues to travel with impunity. The ICC called for his arrest. Curious about what the U.S. is doing to try to address that impunity.
We continually remind countries that they have an obligation, which many of them are not fulfilling. We continue to remind them. You know, these are sovereign states that allow people to travel where they go. We will continue to push this issue. We think that the Security Council action in referring to the ICC should be respected. and the ICC itself should be respected in this regard. We have not had travel to this country, and I think that will remain the case as we look at this. This is a difficult issue.
Please join me in thanking Ambassador Booth, and I think we all wish you the best as you head back to the region.